But I've been talking about the Mitteler all week. Where is about the Mitteler Rebbe? So today I'm going to share with you sort of a variety of different little things, anecdotes or details about his person, as it were. I mentioned, I don't know if I told it to you, but one of the things that's interesting with the Mitteler Rebbe was that the Mitteler Rebbe was a malach. He was... You go to the oil, everyone goes to the oil, right? You go to the oil? Yeah, you go to the oil? Yeah. Did you ever read the Matzevis of the Friedrich Rebbe and the Rebbe? Oh, I see. It's hard to see. Yeah. Point well taken. But if you stand in front, the words are the same. Poi Nitman Keser Teira Geilas Ariel something. I forgot all the words. Sidkas Hashem also Mishpata Misol Rabbi Meheshiv Poi Nitman Keser Teira something or other. Girls Geilas Ariel Sidkas Hashem also Mishpata Misol. Then it says the name. So by the Rebbe, they added the two words Hagon Aleki, which you don't have by the Friedrich Rebbe, but Hagon Aleki. When you look at the Friedrich Rebbe and the Rebbe Rashab, by the Rebbe Rashab, there's two words, but they don't have by the Friedrich Rebbe and they don't have by the Rebbe. So by the Rebbe Rashab, it says the word Chasido Prisha. By the Friedrich Rebbe, it doesn't say Chasido Prisha. So you're asking a dumb question. The Rebbe is not Chasido Prisha, only the Rebbe Rashab. The Friedrich Rebbe is not Chasidu Prisha, only the Rebbe Rashab. Remember, who wrote the Friedrich of Matzeva?
I'm wondering who decides.
The Rebbe, but the Rebbe are Rebbe. But they wrote the same stuff. They copied word for word from the Friedrich of Matzeva. They just added two words. And it makes a lot of sense. And I'm assuming that they took this from a Matzeva, from one of the earlier Rebbeim. The two words that they added from the Rebbe, the Friedrich Rebbe is Hagon Ha'oleki. But by the Rebbe Rashab, it says Chasidu Prisha. By the Friedrich Rebbe, it doesn't say Chasidu Prisha. But the Rebbe did not Chassid Prisha, but the Rebbe, the Ayat was not Chassid Parish. Now, there's many answers to that question, but in a way, Chassid Prisha is a Chasadim. The Friedrich Rebbe was not Chassid Prisha. You know why? Because he was in the trenches. The Rebbe is not Chassid Prisha. You know why? He was in the Rebbe sat in Yechidus and talked to people about stuff. Trust me, it wasn't all holy. He wasn't the Chassid Parish, not because he was Chas v'Sholem, the opposite of Chassid Parish. He was a Rebbe. The Rebbe Rashab was a holy Rebbe. He dealt with holy people. If you weren't holy, you didn't talk to him. In other words, Chasidu Prisha by the Rebbe Nishma Seiden shows on a removal from the world, and it's something of such significance that it's put on the Tzion. It's put on the Matzeva, but the fact that it doesn't say by the Friedrich Rebbe Chasidu Prisha and by our Rebbe Chasidu Prisha is in no way a Chasadim. Believe me, they were not Chasidim. They were not removed from the world, but they're not removed from the world was because they were fighting the Rebbe, the Friedrich Rebbe and the Rebbe. They're in my opinion, they were in a different class. The Friedrich Rebbe and the Rebbe are in a different class from any of the Rebbeim, because our Rebbe and the Friedrich Rebbe, from the moment they became Rebbe, they didn't have a private life. They didn't own avodah. They served the Jewish people without any regard for their own ruchnias, let alone their own gashmias. It wasn't that way by the Rebbe Rashab and by the Rebbeim before. But anyway, my point is, of all the seven Rebbeim, the Rebbe that was most Chasidu Prish was the Mitteler Rebbe. I don't think there's even a question about it. He was a malach. He was mamash in this world. But on the other hand, the Mitteler Rebbe who had his feet on the ground, the Mitteler Rebbe made an entire colony and relocated 2,000 families of Chassidim. You know how much 2,000 families of Chassidim in the 1820s today is? Hundreds of thousands of people. The Mitteler Rebbe moved 2,000 mishpachas of Chassidim from White Russia, where they were starving and dying from hunger, to the Ukraine. He got them land from the government given for free. And they built communities and they built farms in a place called Kherson, and they lived peaceably and comfortably, and in many cases richly, in that land till the Second World War. So the Rebbe Mitteler was not a practical man. There's two sides to him. There's the Ascona side, and then there's the personal side. But the Mitteler Rebbe was a malach. So one of the many expressions that speak to how holy the Mitteler Rebbe is, the Alter Rebbe said. I've told this to you before. The Alter Rebbe held for the Mitteler Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe used to tell Chassidim, when he wanted to speak to his son, he would say, "Gate to my Rebbe." The Alter Rebbe said, "Go to my Rebbe." When the Alter Rebbe said, "Go to my Rebbe," he meant the Mitteler Rebbe. No other Rebbe, father, son Rebbe, had such a relationship. When the Alter was alive, he used to call the Mitteler Rebbe his Rebbe. Think about it. Gate to my Rebbe. So go to my Rebbe and to go to his son. The relationship and the respect was not normal. The Alter Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe thought of the Mitteler Rebbe so high. It's not normal. It's really extraordinary. And it was because who the Mitteler Rebbe was. The Mitteler Rebbe was something else. But there's many expressions the Alter Rebbe would show his reverence for his son. And one of them is, I think it's just worth repeating. Alter Rebbe gesagt, as mein Bedel verrechert, it is as if the King Godel is makrik tedes and kiddush hakadosh yom kippurim. When my Bedel lights up a cigarette, is that the King Godel going to the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur and bringing keteres. As mine, think about it. Why do people smoke? We hate cigarettes. I hate cigarettes, but I know people who smoke. As mein Bedel farechet, when my Bedel lights up a cigarette, it's the King Godel going to the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur and bringing keteres. So we understand what it means that Rebbe smokes. It means that Rebbe smokes. It's a good another zach. It's just a vart that I just wanted to share that with you. Another thing, which is also, it's a little detail, but it makes you crazy. The Mitteler Rebbe was such a great genius, that people who are Mevinim would say, the Gedogetshavah said, that if the Alter Rebbe is the Gaon, the Mitteler Rebbe is Gan HaGoinim. If the Alter Rebbe is the genius, the Mitteler Rebbe is the genius. I'll tell you the whole word. So divided get a chicken lashon hara also. So he built a laugh. The Rogatchover. You heard the Rogatchover. He was a chassid Rogatchover, but he was about Nigla. He was a Nigla person. He was a very, very brilliant mind, and he said, this is the whole quote: "The Welt meint as Elinke is given the gun." You know what Elinke is? Elinke, Eli with the Inke. The Vilna Gaon, to call the Vilna Gaon Elinke, you had to be either a real low life, the Gra. The Vilna Gaon was so great, you have no idea. So the Grogatchover said, the Welt made us Elinke given the Gaon. They think the Gaon was the Vilna Gaon. The Gaon given the Alter Rebbe. Alter Rebbe was the Gaon. And the Mitteler Rebbe is Gan HaGoin. In other words, he puts the Alter Rebbe higher than the Vilna Gaon, which is a big statement. And he says that the Mitteler Rebbe is even smarter than Alter Rebbe. We have no idea what kind of mind the Mitteler Rebbe had. And the Mitteler Rebbe did not understand the value of money. He literally could not understand the value of money. When the Tzemach Tzedek became a Rebbe, the Balagolas and Lubavitch were furious. Why? Because the Mitteler Rebbe needed a coach. He would call a coachman and he'd pay him. He gave him a 1 ruble note, a 5 ruble note, a 10 ruble note, a 20 ruble note, a 50 ruble note, a 100 ruble note. He never asked for change because he didn't know the difference. You need money, here's money. A Yid who was so smart, he couldn't wrap his mind around the value of money. They tell a story from the Mitteler Rebbe. There was a stack of money sitting on his table, and somebody walked in and told the Mitteler Rebbe that it's a counterfeit, and the Mitteler Rebbe threw it in the fire, and he was joking. Because he didn't value money. How could a person who's smarter than the Alter Rebbe, who is smarter than the Vilna Gaon, not know the value of $1? How's it possible?
Yeah, because it's very physical.
Whatever the maybe is, but it's mind-blowing. He couldn't... So the Balagolas used to say that the Friedrich Rebbe was a Rebbe. This Rebbe is phony baloney. He hires you to take him from place to place, and he wants change. He wants to know how much the taxi costs. Yana Rebbe gave you a bill. It was a 1, it was a 5, it was a 10, it was a 20, it was a 50. He never asked for change. That's a Rebbe. What they didn't understand is the Mitteler Rebbe hat nicht verstanden zuerst mit Beer. He was so smart, he couldn't calm down that low. I mean, it's the only way to explain it. Can you imagine a person doesn't value... I mean, the only thing in the world we value is money. This man did not understand the value of money. He didn't understand it. He couldn't understand the value of money. His whole life, even as a Rebbe. I'm sure he had other people handling his money for him, otherwise it would have been not so geschmack. But the Mitteler Rebbe could not understand the difference between one piece of paper that says 100 on it, and other paper says 1 on it, that they're not worth the same amount. It just didn't make sense to him. You push it, did not make sense to him. Number 3, the Maisbet like Boimer. It's just worth touching on like Boimer. But all of us know that like Boimer is a Yom Tov connected to Kabbalah. Like Boimer has to do, I mean, in Halacha, like Boimer has to do with Talmidei Rabbi Akiva stopping to die. As you know, in Shulchan Aruch, when they speak about like Boimer, they talk about the Pasuk Talmidei Rabbi Akiva Milomas, which you have already in the Rishonim. But in Zohar and in Kabbalah, we connect Lag BaOmer to the passing away of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And of course, you all know the irony of it, right? Here you make a Yom Tov, the fact that people didn't die, and here you make a Yom Tov the same day of people did die. It's a kind of ironic, right? Lag BaOmer is connected to the fact that Talmidei B'Kiva stopped passing away, and connected to the fact that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai passed away. How does that work? Is it a good thing or a bad thing? And of course, the answer to that question is it your time or not? And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's histalkus, and the way the Zohar describes his histalkus, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai passed away the same way the Mitteler Rebbe did. But Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's passing is really eerie. He called together the Chevre, the Talmidim, and he said to him, last time we got together and we said Pnimius HaTorah, 3 of us passed away from the great revelations. So I want to get us together again. We're going to say Torah again, and this time I'm going to pass away from the great revelations. Can you imagine your Rebbe calls us, listen, let's get together. I'm going to say a Maimer, and I'm saying the Maimer, my Neshama is going to go up to heaven. How much fun that must have been to be invited to that Fabrengen. But that's what the Rabbi did. It's described in Zohar, exactly what I'm telling it to you. And he gathered them together, and he said Torah, and then he's Neshama up L'mayla, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And he passed away in the middle of saying Torah when he said the word Chayim. The Mitteler Rebbe was exactly the same thing. He passed away in the middle of saying Torah when he said the word Chaim. And the Tzemach Tzedek writes, there's not been a tzaddik who had such a histalkus since the times of Rashbi. So in Chassidus and in Chabad, Lag BaOmer is a big Yom Tov. By Sfardim, Lag BaOmer is a big Yom Tov, because Sfardim are very connected to Pnimius HaTorah. In other words, the reason we kochzach in Lag BaOmer is not so much because of the story of Rabbi Akiva and his Talmidim, although that's a very serious story, it's because of Rashbi. So the Mitteler Rebbe valued Lag BaOmer. It says in Hayem Yem that in Lubavitch, in the good old days, and I hate to use that expression, but it actually is apropos, if you were in Lubavitch on Lag BaOmer, every year they went out to a field. What's the pshat of field? Around Lubavitch there were villages, there were farms. Some of those farms were owned by Lubavitch Chassidim, and every year there'd be a competition who would have the schus to host the Lag BaOmer Fabrengen. It was very costly, it was expensive. Because if the Chassidim came to you for Lag BaOmer, they spent about 30 hours or 35 hours on your farm. They would come the afternoon before Lag BaOmer, and they'd stay deep into the night after Lag BaOmer. And for reasons that I don't understand, the Lag BaOmer Suda was milchik. They ate milchiks, they didn't eat fleishiks. You came and you washed, and the Fabrengen was a marathon, it didn't stop. From afternoon Lag BaOmer till late into the night after Lag BaOmer, in other words, about 30 hours, 36 hours Fabrengen, the table was set and people were sitting the whole time. Nobody sat for 36 hours straight. People came and went. The Fabrengen never stopped. And sometime during the day, the Rebbe came with the wagon. The Rebbe means the Mitteler Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, and I'm assuming the Rebbe Marash. And he would sit at the table, and he would say Chassidus, and he would go. So the Mitteler Rebbe, it says in the Hayem Yem, that one of the most exciting days by the Mitteler Rebbe of Lag BaOmer, the Lashon is, a ganze Yard in Gavat of Lag BaOmer, a whole year people waited for Lag BaOmer, because there were unbelievable miracles, especially about children. People needed children. If you were in the feld when the Mitteler Rebbe came, and you were zeich to get a brach from the Mitteler Rebbe, it was a good one, it worked good. And it says the Lashon, the Mitteler Rebbe in Mashke, he would say, L'chaim, chot at mitzat brias, hatanish getart, even though because of his health he was not allowed. Lag BaOmer was one of the Yom HaMiyuchadim, the Mitteler Rebbe had a lot in common with Rashbi, and he celebrated Lag BaOmer in a very, very special way. Okay, another thing. And this is a little bit more involved and political. So you can all wake up now because I'm going to speak politics. Politics is always fun. But the Alter Rebbe passed away. I just saw it now in the Beis Rebbe. I looked it up yesterday. He had a competition. He had a competitor. Somebody else opened up a parallel shop of Chabad. His name was Rabbi Aaron Halevi Horowitz. And he was the Rebbe in Strashel. There are a lot of Lubavitcher Horowitzes who are his descendants. Rabban Strasheller. When he was older than the Mitteler Rebbe by probably 7 or 8 years. They were so close, they were closer than brothers. Mitteler Rebbe and the Amar Strasheller. They were chavrusas, they learned together. There's a story once that they were walking in the street holding hands. And Alter Rebbe was standing on the porch. And someone commented to the Alter Rebbe about the Mitteler Rebbe and his chavrusa. Today in the Lomas Passion, 2 friends that never separate. In Kabbalah, today in the Lomas Passion is Chochma and Bina. So he saw the Mitteler Rebbe, the Banas Rasha, he said, today in the Lomas Passion, and the Alter Rebbe said, Halavai the Lomas Passion. I wish. At the end of the Alter Rebbe's life, there was a machlekes. The truth of the matter is that the Alter Rebbe picked on Rabbi Shal. He was makbid on certain things that he did. And Rabbi Shal left Liadi. He went away from the Alter Rebbe. When he left the Alter Rebbe said, the Alter Rebbe said, I was ripped out of my head. He was very close to this chassid, Rabbi Strasheller, who in the Beis Rebbe is not even called a chassid, he's called a Talmud. When the Alter Rebbe passed away, he opened up his own business, own chassidus. Now, the Alter Rebbe had left instructions with the Pinchas Reizes that only the Mitteler Rebbe should be his Mamal Abaka. But the Rabbi Strasheller ignored that. The Alter Rebbe called in Pinchas Reizes together with the Mitteler Rebbe, and he said to him, I know that my son is a very big honor. He's not going to stand up for his honor, so I'm telling you that it's your job to make sure that only he becomes my successor and nobody else. And the Pinchas Rebbe wrote a letter to the Chassidim that you're not allowed to go to Strasheller to come on to Lubavitch, and a lot didn't. What's interesting about it is that Rabbi Strasheller was more similar to the Alter Rebbe than the Mitteler Rebbe was. Alter Rebbe showed a lot of his spoilers. Alter Rebbe used to get very excited. Alter Rebbe used to roll on the floor in the middle of a maimer. He would pound his hands into the wall till he was bleed. Alter Rebbe had a lot. The Mitteler Rebbe was cold ice. The Mitteler Rebbe showed nothing. Rabbi Strasheller was also very excited, like the Alter Rebbe. So if you looked at the Alter Rebbe and the Rabbi Strasheller, the Mitteler Rebbe, you would say, who's the odd one out? You wouldn't say the Rabbi Strasheller, you would say the Mitteler Rebbe. And yet the Mitteler Rebbe was the true successor, and the Rabbi Strasheller was just sort of continuing what the Alter Rebbe did. And he had an unbelievable magnetism. He had such charisma, if you were a chassid of Lubavitch and you went to Strasheller, you were likely to get stuck. He had a koyach she'en kamayo. His personality and his passion and his way of doing things was so magnetic. Lubavitch Chassidim were afraid to see him. The story that they tell, it's a crazy story. The two Chassidim of Lubavitch decided to go to Strasheller to check him out, but they knew that they should be afraid of his magnetism, so they took a gartel and they tied each other to the same gartel, and they made a deal that if one sees that the other is getting too excited, he should yank him on the string, like, relax, cool down. Mm-hmm. So this way they went to a maimer, and if he's saying a maimer, one of them got too excited, one yanks on the string, and the other one says relaxed. Then a while later, the other one gets excited, so yanks on the string. Anyway, at one point the gartel tore. One guy stayed in Strasheller, the other guy ran back to Lubavitch. That's how powerful a personality he had. There's a Geshmak Maise. I remember the story of Maise Kongler, but someone told me it's of Zalman Zezmid, that one of the Alter Rebbe's greatest Chassidim, who went over to the Mitteler Rebbe, went to check him out. They were friends. They'd both been Talmidim of the Alter Rebbe, and now he became a Rebbe, and the other one was a Chassid of the Mitteler Rebbe, and they came to check him out. Rabban Levi was so passionate that he would do crazy things. He was very, very passionate. So he's saying a maimer. How do you say a maimer? You sit in your chair, you tie a kerchief around your fingers so you don't float away, and you speak to V'yelakim Chaim. Rabban Levi, in the middle of speaking, he would swing his hands and he would scream at the top of his voice, and then he would stand up. And he's standing, and you could see that he doesn't realize that he's standing. Then, as the maimer would go on, he got up on the chair, got up on the table. If he could, he'd climb up. He was, and you drop it, he was flying. So by the time he was finished with the maimer Chassidus, he was standing on the table, swinging his hands, screaming at the top of his voice. But you saw that mamish, he doesn't know that he's in another universe. So the Rabbi Strasheller is saying a maimer Chassidus. So first he stands, then he gets up on the chair, then he gets up on the table. There's no place to climb. And this chassid of the Alter Rebbe, who was now a chassid of the Mitteler Rebbe, who was observing him, was a maven. He was a maven. And he sees his old friend saying chassidus, and he realizes this guy doesn't know what's going on. But then a maimer finishes, As the maimer finishes, it sort of winds down, and Rabbi Strasheller starts climbing back to earth. And at some point, Rabbi Strasheller realizes that he's standing on a table. But he figures, I'm almost finished. I'll stay until the end. In other words, he's about to finish the maimer, and he realizes that instead of sitting in a seat like a normal person, he's standing on the table. So he made a split-second decision to remain standing on the table. That second, from the back of the room, you hear a voice. Arke, krieg herab van tisch. He called him Arke. He didn't call him Rebbe. He didn't call him Rabban. Arke, get off the table. It was as long as you didn't know what you're doing, it was legitimate. Now that you're aware, Zaya Mensch, sit down. The Baruch Hashem. But the painful part of the story is that a lot of the greatest Chassidim of the Alter Rebbe went to him. And the Mitteler Rebbe was makbid. Mitteler took it personally. And the Frierdiker told the Rebbe, these are things that we really shouldn't know. But now that I know it, you're going to know it, because I'm great at Lashon Hara, you know what I'm saying? The Chassidim who by the Alter Rebbe would daven like all day long, they went to the Strasheller, and they became plain people. Plain people. They started davening with the minyan. They were such great intellectuals, they understood Chassidus at such a high level, and the Mitteler was paid as it cost. There was a chassid by the name of Rabbi Chaskel Droye, by the Alter Rebbe, one of the greatest chassidim. He went to the Strasheller and he became like a Pashto Yid. And he'd run through the streets and scream, Vu is Chaskel. Like he lost everything that he himself would run through. Where am I? Vu is Chaskel. He went to the Strasheller and the Mitteler was makpid. That the Mitteler Rebbe felt that no one is allowed to go to him. The Alter Rebbe said he's supposed to be the Rebbe. There was no direct confrontation, but the Mitteler Rebbe was makpid, and they say that when the Chassidim who went to Strasheller wanted to come back to the Mitteler Rebbe wasn't so quick to take him. He was very, very upset about the fact that the Rabbi Strasheller opened up his own business, and that some of the Alter Rebbe's Chassidim who knew that the Alter Rebbe had made it very clear that they shouldn't be, nobody else should be a Rebbe except for him had gone to the Strasheller. From the journal of the Rebbe, we know more. We know some very interesting things. Why did the machlekes happen? So there's two things that I brought in the Rishimis. This was not known until after Gimel Tammuz. One of them was that there was a fire in Liadi. There was a fire. And people ran for their lives. There was a fire. And the Baal Sashal also ran. He was in the middle of saying, Chassidus, they came to him, there's a fire, and he ran for his life. And he ran into a church. He didn't realize he wanted to save himself. When the Mitteler Rebbe heard the Baal Sashal ran into a church, he laughed. And the Baal Sashal was very insulted by it. Now, just for purposes of contrast, outside the Mitteler Rebbe's oil in Nezhin, I was there, is the grave of a chassid named Rabbi Nachum Mendel Chain, who was a Tomim from the Rebbe Rashab's Chassidim. There was a pogrom in Nezhin. And they wouldn't go into a church. If you would go into a church, the pogromists would not go in after you. And the Galach said to the Mendel Chain, come into the church and they will not hurt you. And the Mendel Chain will not go into a church. And they murdered him in the street, Al-Kiddush Hashem. This is a chassid of the Rebbe Rashab. Wouldn't go into a church. So in other words, the Mitteler Rebbe was laughing, was saying, Yimamish is such a big tzaddik. He's such a big tzaddik. He ran in by mistake. He didn't realize there was a church. But that was the word. The other thing was that the Mitteler Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe, had a rule that when you write his Maimorim, you have to write word for word. Now the Alter Rebbe spoke in Yiddish, and they wrote in Hebrew, which is why any person who knows anything about grammar, and you guys are Lubavitchers, you know nothing but Hebrew. If you knew anything about Hebrew grammar, you would realize that Maimonides Hasidus have the worst grammar in the world. Maimorim have the worst Hebrew grammar, the worst. You know why? Because it's not Hebrew grammar, it's Yiddish grammar. In Hebrew, you say ein. In Yiddish, you say nicht faran. Nicht faran is a double negative. Isn't yes. In Yiddish, you say nicht faran. In Hebrew, in my Maimonides Hasidus, it doesn't say ein, so and so, it says lo yesh. Because it's literally Yiddish translated to Hebrew. Because the Alter Rebbe wanted his Hasidim to write what he said from Hebrew to Yiddish, word for word, with Yiddish grammar. And the Hasidim who wrote his Maimorim were careful to write Yiddish and Hebrew. And they had to write, they were not allowed to add anything. Rabbi Strasheller, when he would write Maimon the Alter Rebbe, he would explain them in the text. He would add his own commentary. And the Alter Rebbe told me he's not allowed to do it. Alter Rebbe said, you want to write my Maimorim? Word for word. Just what I said, don't add anything. Now the Mitteler Rebbe had open season. The Alter Rebbe, the Mitteler Rebbe, there was a love affair. The Mitteler Rebbe could do no wrong, as Alter Rebbe was concerned. The Alter Rebbe said a mime in 5 minutes, the Mitteler Rebbe 100 pages. And the Alter Rebbe never complained. Because the Mitteler Rebbe was on that madrege. It wasn't because the Alter Rebbe was playing politics, you understand? But the Baal Strasheller, he was the Mitteler Rebbe's chavrusa. He was older than the Mitteler Rebbe, but he wasn't the Mitteler Rebbe. And the Alter Rebbe told the Baal Strasheller, if you want to write Hanochas, you have to write word for word. And the Baal Strasheller kept on saying, what about battle? What about battle? And the Alter Rebbe never said to him, but battle's 1,000 madregas higher than you. He said, you have to write Lashon Harav twice. The Alter Rebbe told the Baal Strasheller, he can't come to Liadi for 2 years. For a tzaddik like that, not to come to Rebbe for 2 years, it's like you not breathing air for 2 years. See, when he didn't come for 2 years, then he came again. And again, the Alter Rebbe told him you have to write Lashon Harav, and he wasn't careful. Alter Rebbe punished him a second time. You can't come for 2 years. These were the 2 reasons that he left. The 2 reasons that he left. Because the Mitteler Rebbe was a much, much higher madrege, and Rabbi Shel apparently could not understand that. He couldn't understand that. And that was the basis of the machlekes. Paltiel, Rabbi Shel, when the Mitteler was arrested, he was also arrested. He lived 1 year longer. The Mitteler Rebbe passed away in Kislev, Tov Kuf Peches. Yesterday was his Yortzeit. Rabbi Shel passed away in Tishrei, Tov Kuf Petes. That would be 1828. The Mitteler passed away 1827. But Rabbi Shel passed, there was no Hemshech. There was one generation. His Chassidus exists. And they used to say, that's the bad Chassidus. You're not allowed to learn it. You know, the Lubavitchers not allowed to learn Shel's Chassidus. Anyway, a Yid walked into a shul in Poland, and our Rebbe was sitting and learning Rabbi Shel's Chassidus. So he said to the Rebbe, you're learning this? This is the bad book. You don't learn this. And the Alter Rebbe, the Rebbe answered, as a Zeir Atif Seif. Don't tell me what I can and can't read. It's an incredibly deep book. The Rebbe made him kosher, you know. We even sing his Nigunim in the Lubavitch today. But the Rebbe was a very, very big tzaddik. He was a very great man. But the Mitteler Rebbe was makbid for people who went to him. Now, the next thing I want to talk about, I have till 25, I have another 16 minutes. The relationship between the Tzemach Tzedek and the Mitteler Rebbe is very interesting. Tzemach Tzedek was, all told, about 17 years younger than Mitteler Rebbe. Mitteler Rebbe was born in the beginning of, let's call it 1774. Tzemach Tzedek was born in 1789. 1789. You do the math. 1789. He was 7 years younger than him. He was also his father-in-law. The Tzemach Tzedek married the Mitteler Rebbe's daughter, Rebbe Chaim Mushke, and people assume that she was the oldest, although it's very, very hard to know. The Mitteler got married at 14. But Tzemach Tzedek was 17 years his senior. The reality was that the Tzemach Tzedek was not Makabel Chasidus from the Mitteler Rebbe. Tzemach Tzedek was Makabel Chasidus from the Alter Rebbe. Which means if you want to understand the history of Chabad Chasidus, and you see it in the Maimorim, for people who are experts, they can explain this to you. Chabad has 1 first generation and 2 second generations. And we don't have a 3rd generation. Tzemach Tzedek and the Mitteler Rebbe, who were Rebbes one after the other, are really not 1, 2, 3, they're 1, 2, 2. Because the Tzemach Tzedek was the grandson of the Alter Rebbe, and he was Makabel from the Alter Rebbe. Today is not the time to talk about the Tzemach Tzedek. Chabad Chasidus, we have the Chabad Chasidus that we have to a very great extent because the Tzemach Tzedek is Mesiras Nefesh. One of the things Tzemach Tzedek dedicated his life to was preserving the Alter Rebbe's Maimorim. Tzemach Tzedek spent, think about this number, 32,000 hours. 32,000 hours. Copying, editing, and annotating all the Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe. He spent an enormous amount of time, Poshet, collecting the Alter Rebbe's Maimorim, which were not written by the Alter Rebbe, written by Chassidim, fixing them, and putting Maramakoimis and Ha'oros on them. Over 32,000 hours. He really, really preserved Chassidus Chabad. If you understand Chassidus Chabad, the Alter Rebbe's Maimorim are like, let's say, the Mishnah and the Gemara. The Mitteler Rebbe's Maimorim are like Tosfos and Rashi. Tzemach Tzedek's Maimorim are like the Rishonim. The way Chassidus Chabad becomes developed is every generation of Rebbe makes the original Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe more beautiful, more rich, more complex, more sophisticated, more deep. And the Mitteler Rebbe, in his way, and the Tzemach Tzedek, in his way, were usually played very significant roles in preserving the Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe. But they had a big disagreement. And one of the big disagreements was this cliché expression called Lashon Harav. Lashon Harav means the original language of the Alter Rebbe. The Tzemach Tzedek said that when you write a Maimed, any person reading that Maimed has to be able to know what's the Alter Rebbe's words. So what the Tzemach Tzedek does, he takes Maimed Alter Rebbe, writes it word for word. And all of his comments are in parentheses. You can see it in the Eirat Torah, in parentheses. Sometimes the comments are just sources. Sometimes the comments are involved discussion, a pilpul. But the Tzemach Tzedek makes his notes very, very short. Tzemach Tzedek's notes can be 10 lines, and those 10 lines you can have 35 different quotes from Gemaras and Midrashim and Zayir and Kabbalah and Chakira and Musa and what else. And he makes a whole pilpul, a whole discussion on the original words of the Alter Rebbe, but he does it in a kind of way that's very, very clear. The Alter Rebbe's words are mine. When the Mitteler Rebbe says a Maimer, you have no idea which of the Alter Rebbe, which are his words. It becomes one continuum. The Friedrich Rebbe says in his Siches that when you read the Maimarim of the Mitteler Rebbe, can menzelin the Asias Haravi pedal. You can count the original words of Alter Rebbe like pearls, but you have to be the Friedrich Rebbe to do that. The average chassid, when you read a Maimer in the Mitteler Rebbe, it's a Maimer in the Mitteler Rebbe. Tzemach Tzedek said, if you write a Maimer Chassidus, everyone has to know what's the Alter Rebbe's and what's your addition. And the Mitteler Rebbe just didn't do that. Mamish, the Mitteler Rebbe are like a flood. But Pashtas, it has to do with who they were. The Mitteler Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe gave the Mitteler Rebbe such a free hand in his Maimarim, although with everybody else he was so particular. So the Tzemach Tzedek did it in his style. He kept them in the Alter Rebbe, and his notes are clearly notes. They're written in such a way, it's printed. You have 45 volumes in Ateda. It's Maimarim of the Alter Rebbe, it's Tzemach Tzedek's notes. You can see clearly what's the Alter Rebbe's, what's the Tzemach Tzedek's. And the Mitteler Rebbe did it very different. So they had this disagreement. In addition, Tzemach Tzedek never saw himself as the Mitteler Rebbe's chassid, which is very weird, because he was the Alter Rebbe's grandson, and he knew who the Mitteler Rebbe was. Tzemach Tzedek wasn't a fool. But the Tzemach Tzedek saw himself as the chassid of the Alter Rebbe. When the Mitteler Rebbe became a Rebbe, he did not want to live in Lubavitch. He moved away. He went to live in someplace else. Why? He got money, the story that I told you last time about the money. He invested it in a talis business or something or other that someone else was running, and he was learning and davening. And he says, if I'm going to be in Lubavitch, the Rebbe the Shved, just like our Rebbe the Friedrich Rebbe, the Rebbe the Shved is going to give me work. I don't want to work, I want to learn daven. And the Mitteler Rebbe wrote Tzemach Tzedek a letter, and he begged him, please come to live in Lubavitch, please. So the Tzemach Tzedek wrote back, I'm staying away from Lubavitch, not because I have a problem with you, but I have a problem with getting involved in all the things that are going on in what was called then the Chotzes, the courtyard of the Rebbe. So the Mitteler wrote the Tzemach Tzedek a letter, I promise I will leave you alone. You will not have to help me in any way, in any area you're about to learn a daven. Please, he wanted him next to him. So Mitteler Rebbe knew what Tzemach Tzedek was. Please come and live in Lubavitch, I'll leave you alone. I just want from you one thing. The people used to ask Shalos and Halacha. So the Alter Rebbe used to answer Shalos and Halacha himself. Tzemach Tzedek used to answer Shalos and Halacha himself. We even have tshuvas from the Rebbe Marash and from the Rebbe Rashab and Halacha. The Mitteler Rebbe said, I have one wish in my life. As zwei Chassidim treffen sich, soll man reden Yichudi Lo, und durch Chassidim Mikdash speak about Akdas Hashem. I don't have time, so I want you to write for me the tshuvas and Nikla. That's the only thing. And Tzemach Tzedek agreed and came to Lubavitch. And the Mitteler Rebbe kept his word. Tzemach Tzedek would sit and learn day and night, and when Shilas Halacha came, he would give them to the Mitteler Tzemach Tzedek, and the Tzemach Tzedek would answer. And the Hierach Avrusa named him Nechemia Dubrovna. They would research a topic. You're talking about unbelievable mind, and they'd write up a tshuva. And before they would send it, they would show it to the Mitteler Rebbe every time. And the Mitteler took one look, a glance, good, next. And in their mind, he wasn't really reading it. He was just sort of giving sanction. You know, they wrote the tshuva. They worked very hard. They were big Talmidei Chachamim. They were big Yirei Shamayim. Tzemach Tzedek and Nechemia Dubrovna. Anyway, one time there was an emergency. A person needed an answer to a question in halacha urgently, and the Mitteler Rebbe was busy. So the Tzemach Tzedek says to himself, the Rebbe the Shved, that's what he called the Mitteler Rebbe. We know the Rebbe saying always, the Rebbe the Shved, and Tzemach Tzedek also had the Rebbe the Shved. Never ever made any correction on the tshuvas. So he decided he'll send the letter without showing it to the Mitteler Rebbe, and he'll show it to him a couple of days later. And that's what happened. Him and the Rebbe wrote up the tshuva, and they couldn't wait to the Mitteler Rebbe to look at it, and they sent it, put it away in the mail. 2 days later or 3 days later, the Mitteler Rebbe became available, and they brought the tshuva in, and the Mitteler Rebbe did his his typical cursory glance, and he looks up at Tzemach Tzedek, he says, Has farzen a taisvis, you forgot a taisvis. In other words, what you wrote was wrong, you forgot a taisvis. Someone says, do me a favor, you know, you never said a word, the one time I didn't, yeah. And the Mitteler Rebbe showed him his mistake. He made a mistake. And Tzemach Tzedek was floored. I sat 3 days and I worked at it. My Shver hasn't looked in a Gemara since he became a Rebbe, and in a second, he finds my mistake. He was crestfallen. So the Mitteler Rebbe told him famously, Sorg sich nicht. Bist noch nicht kein Rebbe. Don't feel bad. You're not a Rebbe yet. Meaning a Rebbe cannot make a mistake. You're a gadol shebegdailim. That's the lashon. Zog zich nicht. Do not feel bad. Bis noch nicht kein Rebbe. You're not a Rebbe yet. That's the story. So the relationship was very interesting and very complicated. The Mitteler Rebbe held very much on the Tzemach Tzedek. He wanted him around. He wanted the Tzemach Tzedek near him. There's a famous story where one day the Mitteler Rebbe called in two Chassidim and he said, go to my son-in-law and tell him I'm calling him. And if he tells you he's not coming, nehmt him bam gartel or schlept him ahead. So if he tells you he doesn't want to go, take him by the gartel and drag him to me. So these two Chassidim with the Mitteler Rebbe knocked on Tzemach Tzedek's door and said, the Rebbe, the Mitteler Rebbe is calling, and he says, I'm busy. So they grabbed him by the gartel and they schlepped him. The Tzemach Tzedek probably knew what was going to happen. They brought him to the Mitteler Rebbe's house. They opened the door, knocked on the door, Mitteler opened the door, and he looked at his son-in-law, the Tzemach Tzedek, and he said one sentence, Viful de shir atznei alechas. How much you going to hide? That was it. Viful de shir atznei alechas. The Mitteler Rebbe told his son-in-law, Tzemach Tzedek, Viful de shir atznei alechas. How much you going to hide? And there's a story there's a letter from the Rebbe printed. For the Frierdiker Rebbe, to our Rebbe with the same teichen. What's this business with hiding? But that's the Mitteler Rebbe told the Tzemach Tzedek, Viful de shir atznei alechas. So the story was, Mitteler Rebbe becomes a Rebbe. His son-in-law goes to live in some other city. He literally begs him, please come live in Lubavitch. And I promise, he tells him, I promise, I will not bother you with anything. Shasike. When the Mitteler Rebbe was going to say Chassidus, he would send a messenger to Tzemach Tzedek that he would say Chassidus. And Tzemach Tzedek would come. The way it was, they had a stage, a bima. The Mitteler Rebbe, I think he stood when he said Chassidus, and on the stage behind him was standing the important people, and the Tzemach Tzedek was on that stage behind his father-in-law, the Mitteler Rebbe. But as time went on, it became crazier and crazier. There was no schedule. Mitteler Rebbe said Chassidus 4 o'clock in the morning. He's Chassidus 5 times in a day. When the Mitteler Rebbe's schedule saying Chassidus became completely erratic, Tzemach Tzedek stopped coming. People didn't come. And someone said, I don't understand. The Rebbe the Shver saying Chassidus and you don't come. He says, I feel bad that I'm missing it, but I got to learn. I need a day and a night. And this Rebbe of mine, the Mitteler Rebbe, there was no day, there was no night, there was nothing, it was just dach. And he's the Frierdiker Rebbe told our Rebbe, it's in the Rishimis, that Tzemach Tzedek is nish given as a chossidig. That's the expression. He wasn't so chassidish of the Mitteler Rebbe. He didn't see himself completely as a chassid of the Mitteler Rebbe. There was an enormous amount of mutual respect. But he saw himself as a Makabalish of an Alter Rebbe. The Mitteler Rebbe traveled in probably 1825 to Karlsbad, which is in Germany, for mineral baths. He was sick. The Mitteler was very ill. And the way he describes in the Beis Rebbe, he went there and he actually came back healthier. But while he was in Germany, he met some famous Goinim of Germany. He met Akiva Eiger, he met the Mordechai Banet. And he writes letters to the Tzemach Tzedek, and I met all these great Goinim from Germany, and I told them about you. The Mitteler Rebbe wanted the Tzemach Tzedek to know that I traveled, and I met this person, these are G'dayli Yisrael, and I told them about you. And in Das Tachten, the Mitteler Rebbe knew that the Tzemach Tzedek is going to be the Rebbe after him. And the Mitteler Rebbe was Poshet, preparing the ground. He told his son-in-law, Tzemach Tzedek, I want you to know I met G'dayli Yisrael from far away from Russia, and I made sure they knew what's next, what's coming. He wanted them to know about the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek. The kind of respect that they had for one another. When the Mitteler Rebbe passed away, so Tzemach Tzedek first wrote that his talkus like this was not since time of Shem Bayechoy. And that Tzemach Tzedek said famously, "Am evol geschnitten beim schwerer Finger, wollt nicht gerunnen Blut, es wollt gerunnen Chassidus." If you would take a knife and cut my father-in-law's finger, blood wouldn't flow. Chassidus would flow. In other words, the extent to which the Mitteler Rebbe was absorbed in Chassidus, the Tzemach Tzedek said, if you would cut my schwer's finger, blood would flow, Chassidus would flow. And another thing is, the Mitteler Rebbe printed his own Sfarim. The Mitteler printed his own Sfarim. When he printed during his lifetime, when he printed his own Sfarim, this is a sefer so-and-so, and it just says, Dov Ben, and then all the titles of the Alter Rebbe. When the Mitteler Rebbe passed away, they were still in the middle of printing one of his Sfarim, the Teres Chaim. So they continued to print it. But now that he passed away, they wanted to put by him also fancy titles. So they came to the Tzemach Tzedek and said, what should we write by your shver about titles? So Tzemach Tzedek wrote one of the titles, and one of the things he wrote was, I think, a shafal v'ha'onav, that he's very humble. Now the Mitteler Rebbe did not act humble. The Mitteler Rebbe acted unbelievably tough. The Mitteler Rebbe was very close to his Chassidim, very close. Closer than any other Rebbe was. But he was also more demanding. He was very, very dogmatic. He was very critical, very strong. So you wouldn't have seen the Mitteler Rebbe as a humble, sheepish person. He was very strong. So the Tzemach Tzedek wrote about him, Shofel Va'onav, something like that, and then he said, although my father-in-law on the outside was such a strong and critical personality, the truth was he was a deeply, deeply humble man. And lastly, and this is very interesting, and the truth of the matter is, we don't know much about this, but you could make a whole shit out of this. The Mitteler Rebbe had 7 daughters and 2 sons. The Mitteler Rebbe's daughters were incredibly outspoken girls. They were very intelligent, they're very capable, and they said what they thought, always. If you know, this is not the kind of thing you want to share in a shir. The Shalom Bayis at Tzemach Tzedek and Rebbe Chaim was kind of complicated. She was one of the Mitteler Rebbe's daughters. And she didn't always go along with her husband. And when she didn't like what he did, he knew about it, as did everybody else. You know, she was a straight shooter. Rebbe Chaim of all the Rebbetzins, the one that you see that she had her own mind. You know who she was? She was the Alter Rebbe's granddaughter, the Mitteler Rebbe's daughter, the Tzemach Tzedek's wife, and the Rebbe Marash's mother. Her whole life was Rebbe's. How holy a woman was she? But she was a very strong character, you know. And they had this very interesting relationship. There's a lot of details about this relationship. There's some pretty scary details about the relationship. She passed away before her husband, because when they were younger, the Alter Rebbe asked her to bring her husband's chassidus. Alter Rebbe asked the Rebbe Tzimtzvah Chaim Mushka, the Tzemach Tzedek was 17. Bring me from your husband's chassidus. She brought him the Sherish Mitzvah Tefillah. Alter Rebbe saw what his grandson was writing at the age of 17. He called in 3 chassidim, and he made a shechayanu. And after that, when the Tzemach Tzedek would walk into a room, the chassidim would stand up for him. Tzemach Tzedek was so upset, he wanted to divorce her. And she says, why are you so upset at me? He says, you can't take my things without my permission. They're mine. She said, but the Zayda asked. She says, but according to Allah, you have to honor me before the Zayda. So she said, but he's your Zayda also. And Tzemach Tzedek said, but you have to honor me for him. And he moved out of the house. And the Frierdiker Rebbe writes, the Mitteler Rebbe, Chaim Mushka was a tough lady. She couldn't handle this. And she called her father. And the Mitteler went to say to the Alter Rebbe, they got to fix the Shalom Bayis. And the Alter Rebbe had to make Shalom Bayis between the Tzemach Tzedek and the Chaim Mushka. What was the Aveda? The Gemara says, Hegdichet Avshila, that she burnt his food. The Aveda was that she gave his Chassidus to the Alter Rebbe, and the Alter Rebbe said Shechayanu, and the Chassidim and given Tzemach Tzedek covered. That was his Aveda. But here's the part that I wanted to share with you. The Tzemach Tzedek respected his wife enormously. Tzemach Tzedek was a Rebbe for almost 40 years. His father-in-law was a Rebbe for 15 years, almost 40 years. It was a very hard Nasias. Whenever things were really, really bleak, he would go into the kitchen, the Rebbe would say to his Rebbetzin, Zog famir apor kapit lach tilim. Whenever he had a problem, he would go into his Rebbetzin and say, please say for me some tilim. He used to say, Ich halt von ihr tilim. I think very highly of the Rebbe Chaim Mushka's tilim. This is the punchline. Sie ist der richtige Bas Talmud Chacham. She's the true daughter of the Mitteler Rebbe's Tochter. Sie ist der richtige Bas Talmud Chacham. And the Tzemach Tzedek revered his wife as Bas Talmud Chacham. And it went both ways. There are famous arguments that they had, the two of them. And when she argued and he argued, it's just kind of hard to argue with a Rebbe, you know what I'm saying? When she wanted to win an argument, she would say Bas Talmud Chacham. The Tzedek would never go against that. If she said, I'm saying this as a daughter of the Rebbe, Bas Talmud Chacham, there's a famous story. The Tzedek wanted to delay the Rebbe Rashal's bris. She was saying, what do you mean? Cooked food for hundreds of people, delaying the bris because you're on a whim. So they argued a few times back, a whole night they fought about it. So she says, the bris is today, Bas Talmud Chacham. Argument over. Anyway, they took the baby out to do the bris. The baby was yellow. So she was so angry because she knew that the Tzemach Tzedek pulled it off. You understand? 5 hours before the baby was fine. 5 hours later, the baby's jaundiced. So she said, kunz v'nayatan. She used to laugh at miracles. She was the one who said, miracles rolling on the floor. No, it was her. Her grandfather, her father, her husband, and her children were all Rebbe's. Think about it. And her grandchildren. So she would laugh at miracles. So when the Tzemach Tzedek pulled off that coup, she said the brisses today, Bas Talmud Chacham said, okay, Bas Talmud, I don't argue. But whenever they argued, if she wanted to win an argument, she would say Bas Talmud Chacham. And the Tzemach Tzedek had difficulties and he needed help. He would say to his wife, als Bas Talmud Chacham, Zog für Apaka Petach Tillin.